welcome to Going Deep. I'm your host, Mike. I'm really glad you're able to join me today. At this time in our history, humans are uniquely empowered by search algorithms, social media, and fractured, expert-driven journalism to believe different sets of facts, characterized by an intense, ever-increasing polarization. There are so many sources of information, we all get to pick and choose who we see as authoritative and worthy of turning ideas into facts that we believe, as well as those ideas that we immediately discard due to their source. Because this effectively circumscribes what it's possible for us to experience, it seems like we should get a better understanding of what's happening here. I want to start with a look at confirmation bias and how it affects us all. Then let's talk through some specific examples of public figures. And finally, is there anything that we can get from this that we can actually make practical use of? Let's go deep. So to start out with, what is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias, simply put, is the tendency to notice data points that confirm something that you already believe, and conversely to ignore data points that do not. As an example, if I hold a belief that a certain type of person is a bad driver, when a car pulls out in front of me, if it's that type of person, I'm likely to notice it and go, I was right, and take that idea and sort of hold on to it and remember it. Whereas if it's not the type of person who I'm predisposed to believe is a bad driver, I just sort of shrug, I don't notice that, along with the hundreds of other times it wasn't the person that I am predisposed to think is a bad driver. Now, this confirmation bias, this tendency to notice things that reinforce beliefs we already hold, is reinforced on a neurochemical level by dopamine. Dopamine is the prime motivator of human behavior. It's what makes us feel good. We do pretty much everything to get dopamine. And when we attend to discourse, whether it's reading an article, reading a text, listening to a video, reading a book, talking to a friend, attending to discourse that confirms something that you already believe gives you a blast of dopamine. That's why you like to look at all the various articles that already confirm something. Maybe I have got a belief that political figure X is a bad person. All of a sudden I see all kinds of articles about how this person's a bad person, and here's another data point supporting that, and so on. Now, part of this dopamine effect is linked in with human tribalism and our innate need to be part of a group. And this also is something that gives us a great deal of dopamine, feeling like we belong to a group that's bigger than ourselves. And these groups take all kinds of forms. Some people operate as identified with multiple of these groups. Some people only identify with certain ones. So this could happen at the religious level. You identify with your religion. Family is a very important tribe. We will do almost anything to retain our membership in the tribe of family. And the threat of revocation of one's membership in the tribe of family is one of the scariest threats that we can face. Other tribes include the people that we work with. How many times have underlings been told you're not a team player if they don't go along with everything that the boss wants? Political parties, political movements activate this tribalism, where if a new piece of information comes up that confirms what you already believe, you're going to latch on to that. This even happens in sports teams. I can remember as a kid when a football player I did not like at all got traded to my favorite team. It felt weird cheering every time he caught a pass because I didn't like that guy. So that was introducing some dissonance into my tribal membership of that sports team. Since tribalism is so important and such a powerful motivator, we need to ask ourselves, when does one's allegiance to tribe cross into cult status? Let's put a pin in that and come back to it. Notice that in reality shows today, what's the punishment for the loser in any reality show, whether it's Survivor or Chopped or anything in between? You get kicked off the island. You're not a member of the tribe anymore. In the case of Survivor, they literally snuff out your flame. Ugh. And then you add into the mix social media. And social media's ability to confirm for you pretty much any crazy idea that you have. There's someone out there who is amplifying that. Alternately, with social media, you might put out a fairly benign statement and then get attacked by other people, and that threatens your membership in the tribe. So we need to take a closer look at this tribalism and how it feeds into what we choose to believe and what we choose to discard out of hand. So now I'd like to look at some specific public figures who are in various ways problematic here. And to what extent do we listen to the message, the creative output of these people, while simultaneously acknowledging the aspects of them that can be problematic. So I think the specific examples will help. Let's start out with William Blake. William Blake was a poet and philosopher who, at the time he was alive, was seen as heretical, blasphemous. What Blake talked about, especially in his Marriage of Heaven and Hell, is how our attachment to opposites that have been concretized into their roles perpetuates the opposite of those. So in his time, he was seen as heretical. Now, what school child doesn't know Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright? Not his best work, but still a good poem. What about Carlos Castaneda? Carlos Castaneda was the anthropologist who studied the Yaqui Indian Don Juan Matus and wrote a series of books talking about his interactions with Don Juan. Certain people, after Carlos Castaneda's death, certain people who were in positions to know, came out with information that Carlos Castaneda had basically made the whole thing up whole cloth. However, his books are immensely powerful, filled with insights that have the ability to shift your perspective on things. And he also introduces a fairly unique model of consciousness that is really inventive and really interesting and useful to use. And so, how do we look at his books detailing his interactions with Don Juan in the light of the possibility that these are basically fabrications that he presented as if they were true? It seems to me like that doesn't drain the books of any of their value, their symbolic value or their perspective shifting value. So, as the great mythologer Joseph Campbell once said, a fact is only true for one thing at one point in time, whereas a myth is capable of taking on all sorts of different meanings at different points in time for different people. And so a myth is actually a higher level of resonance with truth than a mere fact is. So to me, I think that's where Carlos Castaneda's books reside in the spectrum. They live in a mythological level where whether or not Don Juan, quote unquote, actually existed really is kind of beside the point, and you're kind of missing the point if that's what you're focused on. Let's look at another example. Jiddu Krishnamurti was the head, the chosen one of the Theosophical Society. And as his own awareness practice grew, he ended up shunning the mantle that the Theosophical Society had placed on him and basically dissolving the organization. Many people today greatly look up to Jiddu Krishnamurti, and if you've never watched any of his talks, they're amazing. And yet I imagine that anybody who was invested emotionally in being a member of the Theosophical Society was not happy with the actions that Krishnamurti took, even though arguably those actions took what had been a message that was pertinent only to a small, limited in-group and blew it open so that it was applicable to everyone. Here's an interesting example. Richard Alpert. Richard Alpert was a PhD holding doctor of psychology, I believe, at Harvard University. And when he met Tim Leary and took some psychedelics and traveled to India and on, he ended up becoming Ram Dass, the great respected thinker and East-West communicator. When Richard Alpert transformed into Ram Dass, I imagine that the people at Harvard were not amused at all. They would have seen this as a huge degradation in his status and probably would have dismissed anything that he wrote from that point on. Whereas for the various consciousness seekers of the day, this transformation constituted a rejection of a concretized, overly rigid system in favor of a broader, more open system. So depending on which group you were identified, you saw his transformation as a self-inflicted wound or as an expansion. So, having looked at a few of these specific examples, how can we make this useful to ourselves in our daily lives? Understanding that confirmation bias is everywhere and intellectual prowess is not going to shield you from the effects of it. So I think the first thing is to be aware. You aren't immune to confirmation bias, and so you need to develop the habit of pausing and asking, am I noticing this just because it confirms something I already believe? And the moment you pause and ask yourself that question, you've already altered your consciousness. You're thinking with a different mind once you've reflected on that. So I think that's one of the things we can take from this. Another is the question of what do we do with the creative output of people who are, shall we say, flawed sources? On the one hand, we've got don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But on the other hand, we've got a source that has been corrupted beyond credibility. So I would like to get your thoughts. When do you discard an idea out of hand just because of its source? For myself, there's a particular news channel, purported news channel, that if I see that an article has come from them, I immediately consider it spin. How about you? What sources do you just not even consider the information once you see that's who it came from? Conversely, when do you amplify an idea just because of its source? Someone that you really like, really respect, you amplify what they're saying because it feels good to be a member of their tribe. You like and respect them, and so you rather uncritically, yes, agree with what they're saying. And thirdly, when are you able to believe and to act free of bias related to the source? Are there times that you can? What do those look like? And most importantly, is this a good thing? Is it good to be able to simply look at ideas irregardless of where they come from? Or is it important to consider the source? Let me know your thoughts down below, and I look forward to joining you again next time on Going Deep. Thanks for coming.